China's youth is giving up. They've quit their jobs, they've abandoned their families, and they have stopped trying in pretty much every aspect of life. What started out as a gimmicky online fad, Bailan, or let it rot, has gained more and more traction with the country's youth and become sort of a peaceful but effective rebellion against the CCP's governance. It has spread so much that it's actually affecting the nation's economy and its future. The CCP is so worried about this that Xi Jinping himself had to come out and call for the help of the country's youth to go back to work.
希望大家牢记党的教诲，立志民族复兴，不负韶华，不负时代，不负人民。在青春的赛道上奋力奔跑，争取跑出你们这一代人的最好成绩。
So in this video, we'll cover how China got here, how did things get so bad that the youth have completely given up on life, and how is this affecting the economy and Xi Jinping's rule?
I'm basically say no to system. I will not cooperate. Then I have my own antisocial behavior. Bailan is even worse than Tanping. So that's the reason why Chinese leadership really worry about this trend.
The phrase is really commonly used by me, by my friends, by the younger people in China.
As we understand it, it's pretty disastrous in the long term structurally, right? Particularly as China's facing the same kind of demographic challenges.
Unemployment in cities rose to almost 20% in July 2022, the highest since the Chinese government started publishing the figures in 2018. As a result, the country's economy has slowed down and is struggling to boost growth.
Okay, before getting into why Xi Jinping is so worried about this let it rot movement, let's start from the beginning. How did we get here, and why are the Chinese youth seemingly giving up on life? I feel like I've shown this chart hundreds of times in my past videos, but here's China's GDP over the last few decades. They've experienced an explosive growth in their economy as China opened up to the world and became the global manufacturing hub. This led to noticeable improvements in people's lives. We can see that if we just look at GDP per capita. Millions of people who were born in underdeveloped villages in rural China were pulled out of poverty and are now living pretty respectable middle-class lives. That's a huge advancement in the span of a few decades. If we look at China's income graph, we can see that in 1990, the average Chinese citizen was making $330 annually. And by 2019, that figure is closer to $10,000. That kind of increase in a nation of 1 billion plus people, well, that's no small feat. The government did have to do a lot of forceful and questionable stuff to achieve this, but I mean, it's still impressive. The main issue here is that there were a lot of questionable policies along the way that the government implemented that are coming back to haunt them now. One of these policies was the one-child policy.
One-child policy was basically exactly what it sounded like, limiting how many children families could have.
In 1979, when it was introduced, China was a poor country facing an exploding population. 400 million births haven't happened because of this policy.
It faced massive famine and housing shortages. Its economy needed time to develop, and the world deeply feared overpopulation. China's response was the famous one-child policy.
Fearing overpopulation, the CCP forced families to have only one kid. Most of us could have guessed, but this led to many problems that we're going to need a whole separate video to cover, but here's a quick summary of what's important for this topic. Because of the CCP's one-child policy, it's expected that soon the country will have more older people than younger workers. Here's China's demographic pyramid in 1980, around the time when the one-child policy went into effect. This is great for any nation. A lot of working adults and kids. Adults are productive members of the economy right now, and kids will be productive members of the society in the coming future. The older population? Well, they already put in their hard work, so now they get to live off the work of the economically productive members of the society. That's why any growing economy usually has a lot of productive members and a smaller number of non-productive members. But due to the one-child policy, China's population wasn't able to replace itself. I mean, think about it. If you need 2 kids just to replace the parents in the future, and maybe a little bit more to make up for any unexpected deaths. That's why the replacement birth rate is around 2.1 kids per family. Coming back to our topic about China's youth, there's a lot of cultural pressure on them as well. Older generations who worked hard and witnessed China's exponential growth now have their expectations set pretty high. They expect their kids to continue the same progress for the family and the country. They expect the current generation of workers to get a higher education, get a high-paying job, and continue building towards a better and better life for their family. And this is not to say that other cultures don't have the same expectations for their kids, but in China, this expectation is a bit unrealistic with the way the CCP is managing the economy. And because of Chinese culture, a lot of adults are expected to take care of their parents, and sometimes even their grandparents too. On top of that, they're expected to constantly succeed in their work life, save up for a house, get married, and keep progressing. This is already too much pressure on a working population that is shrinking in China. But the problems don't stop there.
This video is sponsored by me. We had a real sponsor, but they backed out because they didn't like the topic of the video. So I'm sponsoring my own video. More details later in the video. For now, please hit that like button.
As youth unemployment stands at 18.4%, Chinese authorities launched a sweeping crackdown on private and online tuition, which wiped out an estimated 3 million jobs.
Around 9 million Chinese students are graduating each year. Those graduating today find themselves going into a tough labour market that doesn't match expectations.
Simultaneous slump since May 2020, China's exports and imports, they have unexpectedly contracted.
Economists estimated that China was losing $45 billion in GDP per month.
Currently, China's youth unemployment rate sits at a jaw-dropping 20%. Nearly 1 in 5 young workers don't have a job. This is in part due to the Bailan movement, but also in part due to there not being enough jobs. In the early 2010s, the CCP made a heavy push to get China's students to pursue higher education, which, sounds like a great thing, and it usually is. The more educated a population becomes, the better it is for the economy. But in China's case, everything didn't really go according to plan. The CCP expected China to be a more mature economy by now. But China's economy is still driven mainly by low-income manufacturing jobs. So when the government pushes students towards higher education, these students expect high-income, high-skilled jobs when they graduate. And now the CCP is realizing that there just aren't enough jobs for all these highly educated graduates. This is creating intense competition between graduates to land what little jobs China's economy does have to offer. In this situation, any competent government would tailor policies to attract foreign companies that need this labor and promote more business activity locally so that graduates can find jobs. So what did the CCP do? Why, the exact opposite, of course.
Alibaba's founder Jack Ma has made a powerful enemy, the Chinese president Xi Jinping. The same day, its shares plunged almost 10%.
Xi Jinping is the supreme leader, and Alibaba's Jack Ma learned this the hard way. A $37 billion IPO was cancelled at the 11th hour. Reports say the order came right from the top.
Alibaba was fined a record $2.8 billion for monopolistic conduct.
China has issued regulations for off-campus tutoring services, banning private firms from offering after-school training in core school subjects. Well, the move has raised concerns among both parents and private education institutions.
The sudden policy change has led to a tutoring black market, which could benefit wealthy families and price out poorer families.
In an attempt to reel in China's billionaires and send a message to all Chinese elites, Xi Jinping set out to destroy Jack Ma, and the majority of the tech sector, really. With trumped-up regulations and fines, the CCP destroyed hundreds of billions of dollars in value for China's tech companies. And with these companies getting battered from all sides, the job prospects for many graduates disappeared overnight. On top of this, the CCP also banned the whole tutoring industry with a snap of a finger, which was worth close to $100 billion at the time. Tutoring was a common job option for many highly educated graduates that, well, disappeared in an instant because of the CCP's actions. So when you factor all this in, you can see why finding a job is getting harder and harder for China's youth. And and the CCP had been of no help. And then COVID hit.
Journalists from Chinese state media arrive in Wuhan to cover a story about a mysterious new virus. The few confirmed cases of the disease are at a seafood market.
Wuhan in China now on lockdown as the country struggles with fear of a pandemic.
Desperate measures to try and contain the deadly coronavirus.
That deadly coronavirus outbreak has authorities taking new, unprecedented, drastic action today as they try to keep a lid on it. 13 cities with a combined population equaling Canada's nearly in lockdown this morning. They're racing to build a new 1,000-bed hospital to treat patients.
Even though the CCP did a good job containing the spread during the early days of COVID, you really can't say the same for 2022. When COVID cases spiked again in Chinese cities in 2022, the CCP went on an all-out war to achieve its utopian-like goal of zero COVID. Brutal lockdowns killed countless businesses and stifled any economic bounce back that China's businesses had been working towards. The global economy was also slowing down, which heavily impacted China and its local job market. As you can see, the job market is shrinking more and more, and cultural pressure to be successful is piling up on China's youth as they get older. As I've discussed in my previous videos, much like the American dream, the Chinese dream is to get a job and then buy real estate. Real estate holds a very important significance in Chinese culture. Men with real estate are considered high status and more suitable for marriage. Going back to the CCP's one-child policy, since families were only allowed one child, a lot of them favored having a boy over a girl. This has led to a drastic mismatch in the male-to-female ratio in China. There are around 70 million more men than women in China. This makes the competition for marriage even more intense, much like the job market competition. This is part of the reason why real estate prices have been skyrocketing in China over the past few decades. And before someone comments, let me clarify, I'm not saying this is the only reason behind the real estate bubble. There are many other factors that play a bigger role, but marriage desirability is at least a small part of the reason behind the price rises in China. Even though the real estate bubble seems to be popping in China, buying an apartment is still very much out of reach for many households. In fact, if we look at this chart from 2016, we can see that many Chinese cities rank in the top 10 worst cities in terms of home prices versus average income of residents. Things haven't improved much in 6 years either. I can't find a chart, but here's a table with the same data. You can see there are still many Chinese cities in the top 10. So, real estate ownership is important in China if you want to progress in life, but it's nearly impossible to buy based on average Chinese salaries. Jobs are getting incredibly hard to get because of intense competition for the small number of jobs that are available when compared to, well, a large pool of prospects. And if you are lucky enough to get a job, working in Chinese culture is pretty intense, especially when compared to the salaries being paid. It's common to see the 996 work schedule in China, meaning you work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, all while making very little money. And if you dare complain about anything, well, employers have all the leverage, since they can replace you in a heartbeat due to the high demand for your job. So as the situation kept getting worse and worse, and the CCP was doing very little to improve the economy, a movement started brewing in China.
Has been awash with the phrase buy land, which means let it rot. This has coincided with many young people in China becoming increasingly frustrated with both their personal and professional lives.
The phrase is really commonly used by me, by my friends, by the younger people in China.
You know, naturally people are going to rebel against something that really undermines their physical, moral and spiritual well-being.
The jobs are scarce, the competition is keen. So that is why I'm saying that I don't want to engage in this kind of competition.
They just can't see any hope in doing so.
Chinese youth have started giving up on trying in an attempt to force the government to improve their situation. So far, on Weibo, the related hashtag has accumulated over 93.2 million views. And searching the phrase on Xiaohongshu results in over 2.6 million user-generated content, UGC, instances. It's spreading so quickly that the CCP has actually started censoring the keywords online. Talking about censorship, some of the videos I'm making on this channel are sometimes considered too controversial for YouTube, and their almighty algorithm may not recommend them to you. So, if you guys can just take a quick second to hit that subscribe button, it would help me out a lot. Appreciate it. Young people have burned out trying so hard for so long to no avail. This is how they make sense of it in their mind. Someone has to be a loser because of the way the economy is set up. Too many people and not enough jobs, real estate prices are too high and salaries, well, aren't. So why try so hard if you know you're just gonna fail? If you don't try at all, then at least you're not disappointed when you inevitably lose, right? So that's basically the thinking behind the whole let it rot movement. I know it sounds crazy to some older folks, but that's how it's being looked at right now in China. Have you guys ever been playing a game where you're losing so badly that you stop trying? There's no chance you're gonna make a comeback, so why not at least, just save the energy? Well, that's pretty similar to how Chinese youth are feeling towards life right now. Even though it may sound silly to some, this is turning into a serious problem for the future of China's economy and the communist government. CCP officials have publicly come out and said that this attitude will slow China's growth and will result in generations of slackers. State media has already started publishing articles about why the youth should avoid Bailan and refuse that mindset. But so far, the movement doesn't look like it's slowing down. Only the future will tell us how much this affects the already slowing Chinese economy. So, since I couldn't get a sponsor, I decided to sponsor it myself and tell you guys about problems with our Facebook page. Facebook has been restricting our videos because it considers the topics too sensitive. Apparently, videos talking about China's economic crisis are too sensitive for Facebook. This makes it hard to grow as a new page, so if you guys use Facebook, it would mean the world to me if you followed my page on Facebook. Our next video about why China has so many enemies will be released on Facebook a full 24 hours before YouTube. So please follow the page. It's the first link in the description. This is China.
Shanghai! Shanghai! Shanghai!
Protests are breaking out all over the country against the CCP and their authoritarian rule. As the number of protesters grow, the CCP is worried more and more about things getting out of control. Just a few days ago, protests in Shanghai turned violent between authorities and protesters. As of Saturday night, there are protests happening in 13 Chinese cities and around 80 Chinese universities. By the time I finish editing this video, these numbers are likely to be much bigger. According to several experts, this is the most serious moment in China's history since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. Because of the threat these protests represent for the CCP, government censors have been quick to block any and all news of these protests from social media. There are signal jammers following the protesters, so they can't post on the internet and communicate with other people. Websites and apps like Weibo and WeChat went dark to stop people from sharing the news about the protests. If there's an off chance that CCP bots may try downvoting this video, I want you guys to take a quick second and hit that like button below. It would help me out a lot. This is the first time ever under President Xi Jinping that Chinese citizens are openly opposing the central government and their rule. This is the first time in a long time people have voiced their opinions against the government, despite what it means for their personal safety. You might be wondering what changed all of a sudden that citizens are so furious with the CCP. The reason behind these protests was a fire in an apartment building in Urumqi, where an estimated 10 people died, and it was all because of the CCP's mismanagement. So before talking more about what these protests mean for the CCP's rule, let's back up a little bit and talk about how a fire in a faraway region gave rise to a movement that threatens the CCP's existence.
Overall policy of zero COVID policy.
There are constant lockdowns and mandatory PCR tests around every corner.
Fences to stop people leaving their flats.
In bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
Electronic magnetic alarms are going to be placed on the front doors of some people in places where they have tested.
Problems started brewing back in March. when China experienced a spike in daily record COVID cases. The CCP made COVID public enemy number one and decided to get China into its utopia-like goal of zero COVID. To achieve this goal, the CCP implemented zero COVID restrictions to stop the spread. If there was even just a single positive COVID case, the CCP would lock down millions of people, shut down thousands of businesses, and implement excessive mass testing. Doing all this basically crippled people's daily lives. But that didn't matter to President Xi Jinping. The government was dealing with COVID as if it was still 2019, all while the rest of the world has moved on. When I say lockdown, I don't mean like a normal lockdown. No. Just like anything the CCP does, this was forceful. Apartment buildings were locked from the outside so people couldn't leave. Neighborhoods were barricaded. And if there was any suspicion of someone having COVID, they were forcefully removed from their family and quarantined in a very much jail cell-looking facility. Even infants and toddlers were not an exception to this rule. Yes, you heard that right. The CCP would actually separate kids from their parents and put them in a quarantine facility. Turns out all of these very forceful policies are now what is coming back to bite the CCP. But we'll get into that in just a second.
In one of the world's richest cities, residents scream, "Give us food." Last week, they were so hungry they ransacked a grocery store.
The world's third largest city remains in lockdown. 25 million residents ordered confined to their homes.
They're using bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
You're shut in. There's like a paper barrier keeping you from exiting, going to the food market.
I can't go outside that door. There's a seal.
In this apartment complex, a woman screams, "We are starving to death."
It's straight out of a dystopian sci-fi movie. Some people are yelling out, "We're starving."
Initially, it was an inconvenience for citizens, since they've learned to let the government overreach slide, just as long as the CCP achieves their goals that improve Chinese citizens' lives. Now remember, that's the most important part. As long as the CCP achieves its goal. The goal of these lockdowns was to kill COVID, achieve a zero COVID target set by President Xi Jinping. But as the days passed, then the weeks passed, then months passed, it didn't seem like the CCP was getting any closer to achieving their goal. In fact, the COVID cases just kept spiking. You can feel that Chinese citizens were getting tired of giving up their lives for something that doesn't seem to be working. Slowly, a movement started brewing. Social media posts started circulating about how lockdowns just don't work and people want their lives back. Worse yet, posts about people dying because of these lockdown measures started picking up steam like wildfire. On November 3rd, a 3-year-old boy died in his father's hands after a gas leak because a COVID worker wouldn't let them leave the apartment complex to seek treatment for the child. The delay proved fatal for the kid whose whole life consisted of lockdown and pandemic. This caused a massive uproar on Chinese social media, before posts were quickly taken down to contain the crisis. Then there was another huge protest at Apple's Foxconn facility. And you guessed it, it was because of lockdown measures. Foxconn had its workers working in this closed-loop management system, where workers would work, live, and sleep in the factories. They were allowed no outside contact at all. As workers slowly got sick of all this, protests broke out and the news reached the international media. Things got so out of hand that there were violent clashes between the workers and the police. Unfortunately, I can't show all the clips because of the YouTube community guidelines, but here are just some of the clips to give you an idea. If you want more news and clips like this, be sure to follow me on Twitter, as I share things there a lot quicker and more openly.
China, news of the protests is censored, but internationally the optics aren't good. Critics say Apple has put itself in a difficult situation with an extreme dependence on China as a manufacturer and as a consumer market.
You can probably tell by now protests are picking up. But until now, they were still under control. Until the fire in Urumqi. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. This is what gave rise to the protests across the nation. This is what led to people chanting in the streets against the CCP and Xi Jinping. This is why current events are considered the most serious moment in China's history since Tiananmen Square.
Media footage from China appears to show people in the western city of Urumqi protesting against COVID restrictions. This is after a fire in a block of flats killed 10 people.
According to state media, the cause of the fire was a short circuit in the electrical panel.
Came after an apartment block fire killed 10 people.
Urumqi officials denied that COVID measures had hampered escape and rescue, but said they would investigate further.
On November 24th, 8:35 p.m., a building under this zero COVID lockdown caught on fire. Residents of the building had been locked in for more than 3 months, and when the fire started, they couldn't get out because the doors were most likely locked from the outside. On top of that, the fire department was unable to get into the compound of the building for 3 hours after the fire started because the compound was barricaded so people couldn't leave. In this clip, you can see the fire department trying to put out the fire, but water couldn't reach the building because they were so far away. It's just sad. The fire resulted in 10 people dead, including 3 children, and left 9 more hospitalized. As the news of the fire spread through the nation, protests broke out across the country. Officials tried blaming the fire victims for their deaths. They claimed that the victims were not strong enough to save themselves, while the people blamed the CCP and its strict COVID policy for the deaths. It's also important to note that the protests first started in Urumqi, which is in Xinjiang. Crowds took to the streets on Friday night in Urumqi, chanting "End the lockdown" and pumping their fists in the air. Video showed people in a plaza singing China's national anthem with its lyric, "Rise up, those who refuse to be slaves," while others shouted that they wanted to be released from lockdowns. This kind of uprising is rare in these regions, where authorities in 2017 launched a security clampdown that forced more than 1 million of the region's Uyghur, Kazakh, and other mostly Muslim peoples into re-education programs. Shanghai was another region where massive protests took place. Late on Saturday night, hundreds of residents gathered for a candlelight vigil on Urumqi Road to mourn the victims of the fire. This was captured on videos widely circulated and promptly censored on Chinese social media. By the way, another reminder to please give this video a like, just in case any bots are trying to suppress the news. People also chanted, "We need human rights, we need freedom," while also calling for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to step down. The crowd also chanted, "We don't want COVID tests, we want freedom. And we don't want a dictatorship, we want democracy." Then, in the early morning, rows of police officers, who were initially just observing, started to move in and push the crowd back, dividing them. This sparked a tense face-off between the police and the protesters. According to a CNN report, several people were arrested and taken into police custody shortly after. Several were also taken behind police lines. Numerous videos showed hundreds of people at an intersection shouting, "Release the people," in a demand for the police to free the detained demonstrators. Even in Beijing, protests are picking up too. People are shouting, "No nucleic acid testing, we want food to eat. No lockdowns, we want freedom. No lies, we want dignity. No cultural revolution, we want reform. No dictatorial leaders, we want elections. No slaves, we want to be citizens." Even as I'm writing this script, there's news of the Chinese police targeting journalists if they are caught recording videos on their phones. The CCP is also kicking out foreign reporters to limit the information that gets out of China about this situation. Many of these protests have broken out on university campuses, which are particularly politically sensitive to the Communist Party, given the history of the student-led Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. As of writing this script, there are over 70 universities where protests have taken place against COVID controls. In my opinion, the most notable one being Shanghai University, which is a top-tier university in China, and also Xi Jinping's alma mater. There, the students chanted, "We need democracy, we need rule of law, we want freedom of expression." It seems like protests are picking up by the second. This is a very important story in China's history, and it's moving pretty fast. This is probably one of the fastest videos we have ever put together, but please, follow me on Twitter for the most up-to-date news as things are moving so quickly. Videos are gonna be slower than tweets. Everywhere you go, including on channels like mine that's critical of the CCP, you hear one thing. China's growth has been impressive. 10% growth for years on end. No matter the size of the economy, that's impressive. But do it in a country of 1 billion plus people? That's nothing short of a miracle. But what if I told you that the CCP has fooled everyone, including me? Their greatest feat isn't their miraculous growth, but rather having everyone believe that they have had miraculous growth.
China's rise has been something of a miracle.
This announcement comes as China's GDP grew by
4.5% in the first quarter of the year.
After 3 years of widespread COVID-19 curbs, China's economy
grew 4.5% year-on-year between January and March,
beating analysts' expectations.
Consumption and retail sales rose in the world's second largest economy.
So let me just first explain how this all started. Just last month, China released its GDP numbers, and surprising to the whole world, it was announced that China's economy grew 4.5% year-on-year, which was much higher than what everyone was expecting. According to a Reuters poll, most experts expected the economy to grow only 4%, while the IMF kept cutting its forecast of China's GDP growth regularly. So it's really surprising that the official numbers are much higher than everyone's expectations. Can China be lying about their numbers? I mean, it's not like the CCP has a history of lying, do they?
Where ethnic Uyghurs, most of them Muslims, have been unlawfully detained and mistreated.
What's surprising is the government isn't reporting many deaths.
Before jumping on, a quick reminder to like the video. My last video, I forgot to ask for your likes, and the video was throttled by the algorithm. And this just proves that your likes make a huge difference in how my videos perform. So please take a second and leave a like below. Let's first look at the history real quick. China's GDP has grown tremendously. There's no doubt about that. You can look at this chart here. But we have to ask ourselves the most important question. Who is counting this GDP? We're not going to fall for the stupid saying numbers don't lie, because in reality, numbers most definitely lie. But sometimes you just have to dig deeper to find that lie. You see, in China, GDP numbers are calculated and published by the local governments and the CCP. There's a big problem here, and to truly understand the issue, first let me explain how GDP calculation works here in the USA. For us, there's an independent federal agency called the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or the BEA, that calculates and publishes all economic data, including the GDP numbers. Now here's the true importance of this setup. We all know politicians love talking about their GDP numbers, whether it be in the US or in China. If things are going good, they love taking credit. And if things are going bad, they love deflecting blame. Basically, GDP numbers are very important to people in government positions. That's why the BEA is an independent agency, so that politicians can't affect the calculations of the GDP numbers. Additionally, politicians' policies do have an effect on the GDP, but the BEA can do little to nothing to actually affect the GDP. Let me explain. I'm sure you guys probably already know this, but here's the simplified GDP formula. GDP equals the sum of consumptions, investments, government spending, and net exports. That means when politicians pass a budget to build a new bridge or a highway, it's part of the GDP. But that GDP is calculated by the BEA, so politicians can't fake the numbers or lie about how much it is. And on the contrary, the BEA has no power to pass any bills to actually increase or decrease the GDP. All they do is calculate what the economy has produced. Good old checks and balances, right? The same checks and balances that are missing in China. Which makes sense considering it's a one-party nation with totally legit elections.
China's once-in-a-decade transition of power was completed earlier today.
Xi Jinping
has just been elected president of China
as China's head of state
and chairman of the PRC's Central Military Commission.
And his nation is on the rise.
And a near unanimous vote, with 99.86% of the vote.
Won by 2,952 votes to 1.
Huh, I wonder what happened to that one guy who voted against Xi. Anyway, you get the point. The CCP has all the power in China, and there's no one who is beyond their reach. There is no such thing as an independent agency for anything, let alone for economic data. Additionally, China's economy doesn't work like the US. And no, I'm not talking about the communism stuff. Here in the USA, we measure how much the economy has grown, but in China, they announce goals and how much they want the economy to grow. Which doesn't sound like that bad of an idea until you start digging deeper. Beijing sends out annual goals to local leaders of each province in China. Then these local leaders are responsible for achieving these goals. Theoretically, they're supposed to do this by, attracting businesses, promoting entrepreneurship, improving infrastructure, and several other ways you can see here on the screen. But the problem is sometimes these don't always work. The economy naturally goes through peaks and troughs. But in China, that's not an option. You see, politicians' careers are dependent on hitting or even exceeding the target set by the CCP. Promotions are based on how well your region does. Worse yet, sometimes missing GDP goals can mean penalties like demotions or even dismissal. So, officials are highly motivated to make sure they provide results by any means necessary. Of course, that includes lying. But I will get into how lying has gotten Chinese officials in deep trouble, but first, let's go over the easiest way to hit GDP goals, and that is government spending. If you guys recall our GDP equation from before, GDP is equal to consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net export. Easiest way a government official can increase GDP is just approve more and more government spending. And that's exactly what so many Chinese officials have done. But unlike the USA, the central government doesn't provide funding for local governments to spend in China. The CCP sets the targets, but local governments are on their own when it comes to funding. Worse yet, tax dollars actually just go to Beijing. So that means the local governments have to get creative when it comes to raising money for local projects. I have talked about this extensively in my previous videos, but one big way local governments would raise money was by leasing out land to developers. So, if you think about it, governments were directly benefiting from the real estate bubble. The more money a developer can borrow, the more they could bid on lands, thus helping local governments raise more money. Now, we already know that the China property market is slowing down, and to make sure the country doesn't collapse because of debt, the CCP had set 3 red line policies for property developers. But since the CCP's 3 red line policy, the revenue for local governments has dropped drastically, which puts some of them at risk of default. Technically speaking, local governments can't borrow money. So to get around this rule, they would set up companies called Local Government Financing Vehicles, or LGFVs, which allowed them to sell bonds and borrow money. And since these LGFVs were owned by the government, investors assumed they were relatively safe bets. But they aren't as safe as people would assume. So here's how the government loans work in theory. As long as the money is used to create economic output that's more than the interest on the loan is a success. But that's where the problems start. Local governments aren't just borrowing money to improve their local economy. They are borrowing it to artificially prop up the GDP numbers so that they can achieve the goals set by the CCP. I always go back to this simple example to explain the workings of government loans. Let's say you're in a village and your government borrows money to build a railway line to connect the village to a city. Now, money spent on that railway line counts towards the GDP, and it's a great use of government spending because residents of the village can easily, get a job in the city because commute times are now shorter. Now, what if next year the government borrows money again and builds another train line just like that one, because the spending counts towards the GDP, right? I'm sure all of you can see that this is a very dumb reason to borrow money, even if it increases the GDP in the short term. Now, I will admit, this is a very simplified example, but in reality, a lot of local governments in China are doing exactly this, just at a more complicated scale. They would borrow money just to prop up the GDP numbers in the short term. They're not worried about long-term ramifications of these loans because as long as they hit the CCP's targets, officials will get their promotion, and the future will be somebody else's problem. So remember this. Chinese local governments are over-leveraged, and some are very close to bankruptcy. We will talk about the effects of this later in the video. Now, let's talk about another way local officials increase the GDP numbers, and that's by just straight-up lying. You know how I said in the beginning, officials are the ones reporting the GDP numbers to the central government in Beijing, and then the CCP publishes it to the world. Sometimes local officials just increase the reported growth numbers arbitrarily. Since there's no agency to verify the numbers, and there's no checks and balances in place to deter this from happening. Crazy part is that the CCP even knows this. The CCP Premier, which is one of the highest ranks in the CCP, has told other countries that China's GDP numbers are man-made because of this issue. They know this is going on, but they're not too focused on fixing it because high growth makes the CCP look good. Even if the CCP wanted to fix this, the effects would be catastrophic. Since this has been going on for roughly 2 decades now, the fake numbers have compounded. You see, lying about a few basis points isn't a big issue to fix. But if you lie one year, now you have to lie a little more next year, and then the next one, and so on, and by the end of it all, the reported number is extremely far off from reality. On top of this, no one has any incentive to really fix this. Why would the central government want to fix this? It only makes them look bad in front of the world and their own citizens. And why would local officials want to fix this? It could lead to serious penalties against themselves. And in the past, the CCP has shown that it is not afraid to use capital punishment against government officials. But this really does beg a question. How big is China's economy actually? And how strong is it in reality? Now, that's something that is impossible to figure out from the outside, especially for a small YouTuber like me. Luckily for all of us, there are a bunch of people much smarter than me who have tried tackling this question before. Let's get into that. There's a study done by Professor Luis Martinez, where he looked at many countries' GDP growth and their nighttime light intercity from satellite imagery. Based on this data, Chinese GDP growth over the past 20 years may have been about a third slower than reported each year, leaving its economy significantly smaller than that of the USA. Now, this study mainly focuses on GDP growth, and if you want to read all the details, you can easily find it online. But Dr. Yuri Skasfut from the channel Money and Macro actually used data from the study to roughly calculate the actual GDP of China, and the results were kind of shocking. Again, I want to reemphasize these are rough calculations. It's impossible to get exact data because of the way the CCP operates. But according to his calculations, China's actual GDP is 60% smaller than what the CCP reports to the public. Yeah, you heard me right. 60% smaller. If you want to learn more about his calculation, definitely check out his video. But let's just assume China's real GDP is somewhere around 60% less than reported. That means the debt they have is astronomically higher than anyone has ever realized. Remember earlier we talked about how local governments loved borrowing money using LGVF? Now, I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about government debt because of the issues we have with our own national debt. But one argument most people usually make is that our debt isn't that high, if we consider that our GDP to debt ratio is relatively small when compared to other nations. If we apply the same argument to China, we can see the true scale of the problem. The Chinese government loves taking on debt and continuously lies about their GDP. So their debt to GDP ratio is extremely high. I'm sure that the heads of the CCP are already stressing out over the debt time bomb that is ticking faster and faster. And only time will tell how it will play out for China and the CCP. The year is 2022, and we are seeing a wide range of incidents and events that we did not expect. Or maybe more accurately, did not expect to take place so soon. Along with other heart-stopping news from the global landscape, we are now seeing China enter the conversation, and unfortunately, it is not for positive things. Even though we are still just in the first quarter of the year, one look to the west and you can see that the dragon seems to be slipping down. Yes, China's economy seems to be getting worse. And at this point, it just doesn't bode well for investors and those whose fortunes are tied to the Chinese state. I know after the Evergrande and Alibaba declines last year, many thought the worst was over, but no. It seems this dance has only just begun. Over the next few minutes, I will be explaining to you why the Chinese economy is getting worse and the reasons and effects behind this. For the benefit of your portfolios and your monetary interests, you will want to watch this video in its entirety. I can guarantee that some of the reasons you will hear here will shock you and inspire you to reevaluate your positions and investing outlook in general. When the second largest global economy starts slipping, it's wise to pay attention. Right, so without wasting much time, let's dive right into why the Chinese economy is getting worse. Talk about how China is suffering silently has not begun today. It has been a hot topic, even on this channel, in the past year, as different events and different situations transpired, both within the Chinese borders and externally, that spelled doom for the nation. As we go over the reasons that are acting as catalysts to the decline of the nation's economy, I will do my best to recap the videos for you point by point. But if you haven't watched past videos on the topic, I highly recommend you check them out on the channel. Now, sip your coffee and let's proceed. It is prudent that I talk about the real estate sector issues first, as the real estate sector contributes to 29% of China's GDP. Last year, one of the largest property developers in the world, Evergrande, had a situation that sparked what could only be described as the beginning of the decline in the Chinese real estate market. Let me recap it for you very quickly. Chinese property giant Evergrande, whose liabilities exceed $300 billion, failed to meet interest payments to international investors. That situation spooked investors who feared contagion across Chinese property and banking sectors, as the giant company scampered to find a solution. Evergrande also began selling assets to raise the money it owes to customers, investors, and suppliers, and its own employees. However, this did not last long. Finally, Evergrande failed to meet a debt repayment and defaulted on 2 bonds. There are several reasons why Evergrande's problems were a major concern in regard to the economy of China, and even on a grander scale. This included the fact that many people had bought unbuilt properties from Evergrande, and a default meant people could lose their funds in totality. Also, defaulting on international debts meant sending a lot of companies into bankruptcy. There are several other reasons, but you can learn about those by watching other videos on this channel. In 2022, the damage to the real estate arena has not been fully recovered, and in fact, it keeps worsening. The Chinese real estate market is falling at a rate of 1% per month, and this is sending property values all the way down. Also, other real estate giants are suffering defaults due to a wide array of issues. Not least among them is China's issue of ghost cities. You see, about 20% of the total urban housing properties in China, which account for around 65 million properties, are vacant. This 20% includes large sections of cities like Tianducheng, Thamestown, Binhai, and many others, which span across hundreds of square kilometers, but have far more empty buildings than occupied ones. Such ghost cities in China have well-connected roads, infrastructure, skyscrapers, and a variety of public spaces, but are vastly underpopulated and have vast areas that are complete without residents. Normally, the conventional definition of a ghost city is one that was economically booming with a large population but is no longer thriving. China's are the opposite. Its third and fourth tier cities are fully built up with the promise of becoming economic hubs. But due to high investment costs or a lack of economic opportunities, they fail to attract inhabitants. With money tied to unlivable, unsellable, and unoccupied buildings, real estate companies are in compromising positions. The challenge that then comes for developers can potentially impact China's financial system significantly. If several real estate developers and firms default, as Evergrande did, banks and other lenders may be forced to lend less. That could lead to what is known as a credit crunch, when companies struggle to borrow money at affordable rates. In this light, a credit crunch would be very bad news for the world's second largest economy, because companies that can't borrow find it difficult to grow, and in some cases are unable to continue operating. With the implementation of the 3 red line policy by the CCP, a set of rules that just put a cap on the amount of money a company can borrow, it was basically guaranteed that companies could not get new debt anymore. This resulted in the companies who were now struggling for cash suffering bond price sell-offs, along with stock price slumps. Given that about 90% of the Chinese population has ties to real estate and home ownership, it makes sense that such a reaction would occur. After all, if the company is struggling, who wants to own their bonds? Bonds meant to guarantee safety. Due to this, China's biggest bond saw $460.4 million of outflows last month alone, as an exodus of money from Chinese assets continued. Couple the declining real estate values, the ineligibility of real estate development companies to secure more money to finish and start projects, along with investors massively pulling money from Chinese markets, and the problems just pile up. When the factor responsible for almost a third of the nation's economy suffers such deep issues, then you can be sure that China's economy will feel the punch. Right, the causes of China's problems aren't done, however. Hang on, you'll really want to hear about the next one. If you haven't watched past videos on the subject of regulatory pressure by the Chinese Communist Party, I highly recommend you check out the videos on the channel. But here's a brief recap. The CCP has its hands in everything. By everything, I mean everything. This is evidenced by the Alibaba sanctioning that led to massive losses that the company still has not recovered from years later, and the Ant IPO that, despite being set to be the world's largest, was blocked by the CCP to inflict a major blow on Jack Ma. This came in the aftermath of Jack Ma giving statements that were regarded as offensive to the government. What the CCP did with Jack Ma, and has since done with hundreds of other companies, only serves the purpose of showing us how intensely difficult it is to prosper in China. Once a company begins to get too large and the owners too powerful, the CCP immediately intervenes to stop them from having too much power. What this does, however, is limit companies from growing to their potential. It also places a cap on the kind of growth one can have without being political, aka supporting the CCP. Because of the influence that the CCP has, it has, in recent times, been performing market manipulation at its finest. This means that there can be no faith that can be placed in the Chinese stock market behaving organically. The stock market has double-digit swings, both positively and negatively, frequently. And this does not bode well with anyone with the smallest idea of how safe investing should go. The CCP has even gone so far as to pump billions of dollars to inflate the Chinese stock exchange, when they have felt they were leaning towards the losing side in regards to public perception. This manipulation has resulted in money being lost in the millions by unknowing investors. The CCP, aware of this, has come out to say that they will ease strict regulations on both the stock and real estate sector. But this is a take as old as time. We have heard these same words before, and yet the result has been the same. With the CCP in power, China has become uninvestable. Foreign money is hesitant to come in, and given the fact that only 9% of residents in China invest in the stock market, this is going to cause problems of an irreparable nature to Chinese stocks and businesses. If you have Chinese stocks in your portfolio or are considering buying some, this is the time to reevaluate strongly, or at least make sure you have the stomach for it. The reasons for the decline of the Chinese economy continue. You cannot afford to miss out on these next ones that I will discuss. Another major reason why China's economy is bound to get worse than it currently is comes as a result of China's actions on the world stage. You see, China, as of late, has a terrible foreign policy that has manifested in unstable or weak ties with the rest of the global community. You're probably wondering how that would have an impact on the economy. Well, let me enlighten you. China is an export nation. China exports consumer electronics, data processing technologies, clothing, other textiles, optical gear, medical equipment, the list goes on and on. The problem is that due to the foreign policy they implement, the nation is disliked by its best customers. This means that the trade agreements and relationships become very fragile. This is why analysts give China about 10 years to become a service-based industry if it wishes to continue growing, or at the very least preserve its progress. In light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, some fears exist within the nation and its economy that the USA will sanction China for its ties with the Russian government. This comes in light of China either supporting, condoning, or actively clearing the diplomatic way for Russia to proceed with what seems like generally frowned upon actions. Whether this takes place or not is yet to be seen. However, the possibility of it has investors on edge. One can argue that the domestic issues that China has also threaten to collapse the nation from within. Chief among them is their unbalanced population, which holds more elderly people than working-class folks, the effect of which will compound more and more with time as the effects of a low birth rate continue to plague the country. Soon we will see a working population whose tax contribution can no longer support a large base of retirees. Only recently, China announced that Shanghai, the nation's second-largest city, would be going into another lockdown, much to the outcries of many citizens. This started off as a level 2 lockdown, but now it requires everyone to remain confined to their homes. This has the obvious effect of negative economic growth. You see, it's estimated that if this persists in Shanghai alone, by the time the lockdown there is lifted, it would have had a 0.4% GDP impact on the entire nation's economy. This might seem small, but when you look at the size of China's economy, you can see that this is a lot of money on the line. Chinese cities have been having lockdown after lockdown since 2020, and this latest Shanghai lockdown further emphasizes the point that companies who had their businesses affected were making. You see, the Shanghai lockdown will affect the Apple factory there, and the Tesla Gigafactory that is there as well. If this continues, the aforementioned companies might wish to relocate elsewhere, which would be a heavy financial blow to China, from lost taxes and employment opportunities from those two companies alone. The last thing to note is that supply chain issues that were already a problem and are still in the process of being rectified will be magnified following the lockdown of such a big city, a city that houses almost 30 million people. The reality of the situation is that China is in big trouble. More trouble than many would like to admit right now. Between all the issues stated above, one can see that it won't take a lot of further catalysts to mess up the economy. I guess it's a matter of time to see when and how the Dragon of the West will react to this, and if indeed their economy will fall under the weight of all these issues that are plaguing it. China has a lot of problems. Banks are crumbling. The real estate bubble is popping. And now, even the economy is taking a hit.
China is now struggling with its finances.
They have this real mismatch between how much money they have coming in and how much money they have going out. They have this increasingly large wall of debt that's maturing.
A $23 trillion debt crisis facing provinces all across China.
But there's one issue that everyone is overlooking. And if the CCP doesn't solve this issue quickly, it could signal the slow end of the CCP's rule in China. That issue is China's tax crisis. You see, for the CCP, or really for any government in the world, taxes are incredibly important if the government wants to continue existing and having power. You guys remember this clip from Breaking Bad?
I'm a drug dealer.
Wrong. Million times worse. You're a tax cheat.
It's a little funny, but kind of true. In the government's eye, a tax cheat is much worse than a drug dealer. Because when you're evading taxes, you're hurting the government's pockets. In China's case, hundreds of millions of people are evading taxes, and that has created a catastrophic tax crisis for the CCP. In fact, it is not far-fetched to say that China's tax problems among nations of its economic size are the worst we've seen in the modern day. China's taxation problem is not even just a singular matter. It is a multi-layered issue, driven by a complex web of factors. These factors include, but are not limited to, structural deficiencies in the tax system, tax evasion, corruption, and weak enforcement of tax laws. Today, we're going to dive into all of these factors and more as we analyze China's horrible tax problem and how it threatens the Asian country's future.
Chinese President Xi Jinping, he has a lot on his plate, of course.
Taxes as a percentage of GDP, it has not gone up.
China's economic landscape faces a series of challenges here.
China unveiled its biggest package of tax breaks.
The government loses an estimated 1/3 of its fiscal revenue every year through tax evasion.
Lower amount of taxpayers indicate lower tax revenue and then higher government expenditure.
What we need to understand as we talk about China's tax problem is the fact that, as developed as it is, China's economy is still a growing one. On top of that, the nation of over 1.4 billion people has what was, until recently, the world's largest population. What this means is that there is a massive demand for social amenities like healthcare, education, and infrastructure, among others. To develop such facilities and fund these programs to cater to such a large population, the Chinese government relies heavily on taxes collected from individuals and businesses operating within its borders. Just like any other nation, the taxes from the citizens cater to public matters and the development of public amenities. That is how it is in China. Or, well, at the very least, that's how it should be. Instead, the flow of tax money in China is quite complex and perhaps unique. This is due to the inclusion of different levels and different types of taxes that are collected. Now, let me explain what all this means. It's honestly quite interesting. You see, the tax system that operates in China is made up of 3 levels. These are the national level, the regional level, and the local level. At the top, we have the national level, which deals with taxes collected by the central government of China. After that, we have the regional and local levels that represent and hold taxes collected by provincial or municipal governments. The national level collects taxes like income tax, value-added tax, and corporate tax. The regional level, on the other hand, collects taxes such as resources tax and urban land use tax. And then lastly, we have the local level that collects taxes such as land value increment tax and city maintenance and construction tax. It's quite a complicated system, and often it involves a lot of overlapping responsibilities, which then makes it all the more confusing. This systematic chaos heavily contributes to the tax problems that they have, as you will see throughout this video. This central government has the authority to impose many of the tax laws that apply to the entire country. Also, by it being a key body, it sets the tax rates for taxes that are collected across the board. This is something it does often, even in service of political agendas, as we will soon discuss later on in the video. On the other hand, the local and regional governments have more limited authority, but they collect taxes from entities within their respective jurisdictions. On the other side of the spectrum, at the lower end, we have the local governments. These collect property taxes, individual income taxes, and other taxes such as car and boat taxes, minor taxes. The local government taxes are lower than the national taxes, but they still contribute substantially to the state's revenue. In fact, they are a key part of the state's revenue, and they rely on those taxes greatly. The problem begins with the fact that they have to remit some of these revenues to the central government, the same government that would have initially dictated the collection rates. This creates tension between the central government and the local governments, so far as tax collection is involved. Often, the local governments in China have been accused of failing to remit their tax collections to the central government, leading to revenue shortfalls and inefficiencies in the tax system. In addition to this, there have also been accusations that the local governments use their tax collections to fund social programs in their districts, thereby undermining the national government's tax policy. This level of strife has created a situation where the central government must balance its need for revenue, its desire to provide social programs, and its willingness to enforce tax laws. This is not something that is as easy as it sounds. It's no wonder this has resulted in massive deficiencies and somewhat of a chaotic system and operating environment. Speaking of chaos, one of the problems that has come as a result of China's taxation system is, well, a debt problem. I'm sure you are no stranger to hearing about China's debt problems, especially after everything that has been happening in the recent years. You remember this, don't you?
China's debt crisis.
Debt crisis.
Debt crisis?
Infrastructure debt is piling up, and China is increasingly juggling to keep up appearances.
Have this increasingly large wall of debt that's maturing, which they'll also need to roll over or somehow refinance.
Just the tip of the iceberg of the $23 trillion debt crisis facing provinces all across China.
On top of all the debt that China's been experiencing, the nation's local governments have a major debt problem as well. One that has increased significantly over the past decade and added fuel to the national debt. China's local government debt problem has been growing since 2008, when the global financial crisis occurred. That global disaster seems to have been the catalyst that made everything worse. At that time, China decided to do something to help itself in the crisis. To this end, China released an economic stimulus plan worth an estimated $586 billion to stimulate its slowing economy and build new railways, communities, subways, and airports. The idea was that in these public construction phases, the entire economy would benefit and employment would be on the rise. However, $586 billion does not just magically appear out of thin air. To finance the stimulus package, local governments in China borrowed money from all kinds of sources, including state-owned banks, non-bank financial institutions, and shadow banks. Basically, if someone or something was giving a loan, they took it. As a result of this borrowing, local governments accumulated a lot of debt, some of which have been used to develop projects that have yielded little to no economic benefit. So ask yourself, if the projects themselves aren't yielding economic benefits to pay off the debt taken to finance them, then where is the money to clear the debt supposed to come from? Well, this is where taxes come into the fold. China's local and regional governments have been relying on taxation as their primary source of revenue. The very same tax revenue that is needed to clear off the mountains of debts they find themselves under. If China had a good amount of taxes to rely on, this wouldn't be a problem at all. However, they don't. Like I said in the beginning, China's tax system leaves a lot to be desired. To start with, the country's tax base has been very limited through various government instructions and laws meant to gain political popularity. At the same time, many taxpayers have been evading taxes for years. So we already have a mixture of very limited taxpayers, and among those, we have a lot of tax evasion. Think about that. It's no wonder that the tax system in China has been regarded as weak, opaque, and ineffective. Do you know what else can make weak moves? The YouTube algorithm. Please like this video and consider subscribing. That helps boost the video's reach in the face of an unfavorable, weak algorithm. I really appreciate it. Okay, back to the basics. This situation, as it is, has made it difficult for the country to collect enough revenue to cover its spending. Local governments, on top of the debt they already owe, are finding it hard to fund their existing infrastructure projects, which have resulted in more borrowing of money. This is something they have mostly done through something called local government financing vehicles. Just so we're on the same page, the local government financing vehicles are legal vehicles used by local governments to borrow money outside of their budget. The government would set up a fake investment company and sell bonds through this company to borrow money. These vehicles have been the primary way that the local governments have funded their projects. But in a way, you can also say that they have been one of the primary reasons why the debt problem in China keeps worsening, due to the ever-expanding ceiling of debts as the local governments keep borrowing. What makes these local government financing vehicle bonds so popular among investors is that they are deemed to carry implicit guarantees that the local government backing them will step in to make repayments should the vehicle default. True to form, the local governments go to great lengths to prevent local government finance vehicle defaults, as they are concerned the non-payment will sully their own creditworthiness and make it more expensive for them to issue their own bonds. So it's quite a vicious cycle that keeps going around in circles and increasing the bottom line debt. This debt issue is no small matter. In fact, it is one of the reasons why China keeps heading towards a dangerous path. The ramifications of it are not just at a national level. They have spread to be at an international scale where things have become increasingly dangerous for the economy of the nation. To this end, China has tried to crack down on local government debt itself. The country's National Audit Office has been auditing local government debt since 2010 to try to get to the bottom of this mess. These audits, much like I've said before, have revealed that local governments in China have borrowed money to finance infrastructure projects that have not been profitable, or have been used for the development of real estate projects. This has prompted President Xi Jinping to intervene in a bid to keep the country afloat and to speak out. President Xi highlighted preventing and diffusing local government debt risks in an article focusing on economic growth and risk. He said, "It's necessary to consolidate the responsibility of provincial-level governments to prevent and resolve hidden debts, increase efforts to dispose of outstanding hidden debts, optimize the maturity structure of debts, reduce the interest burden, steadily promote the unified supervision of local government hidden debt and on-the-books debt, and resolutely curb the increase of hidden debt." Given the way that the CCP operates, you know it's a real dilemma when the president speaks out directly against certain practices. Also, to protect the status of the central government, China's finance ministry has repeatedly made it clear that local governments are responsible for their own debts, and that the central government will not come to the rescue. The central government, and by extension the CCP, will not take the blame on their own name due to the skyrocketing debt of their local governments. That says a lot about their own trust in the direction that local governments are going. To quote China's Ministry of Finance, "If it's your baby, you own it. There will be no bailout from the central government." Harsh, but, well, possibly necessary. I guess I'll leave you to be the judge of that. Another thing that's harsh is how less than 25% of you guys are subscribed. If you enjoy the video, please hit the subscribe button below. That will help make sure that you guys can watch my future videos. Now that we've spoken about how the tax system in China works and about the debt the local governments have accumulated, let's talk about something we glazed over earlier. Why exactly is China's debt revenue low? Why can't these local governments fully fund themselves and their activities without the need to borrow external amounts? Well, let's dive into that. Primarily, China's taxation problem is characterized by the country's low tax collection rates. China, quite frankly, collects very little revenue compared to its size and the size of its economy. China's tax collection rate tends to be much lower than that of other countries with economies comparable to China's. Let's talk numbers, shall we? According to CEIC data, China's tax revenue as a percentage of the nation's GDP was reported at 4.3% in March of this year. That alone marks a record decrease from the previous number of 12.6% for December of last year, 2022. In fact, when you average tax revenue as a percentage of GDP from March 1995 to March 2023, it comes down to 14.3%. That is a pretty underwhelming figure for an economy the size of China's. This is in contrast to economies like Denmark, which takes 35.5% of their GDP from taxes. Or even the US, which has almost 30% of its GDP from taxes. In comparison to these nations, not only is China not even at the global average, it is basically at half of what its peer countries take. The question becomes, why is this so? Well, in reality, the low tax revenues are partly due to structural deficiencies in China's tax system. The complicated Chinese tax system creates, well, problems regarding efficiency. For instance, the tax base in China is narrow, and the tax brackets are not well differentiated, which results in low tax revenues. Let me expand on that. In China's tax system, only a small percentage of taxpayers are subject to personal income tax, while businesses are not obligated to pay corporate tax when they report low profits, reducing overall tax revenues. These factors reduce the base of potential taxpayers significantly. It goes without saying that when the tax base is reduced, so too are the potential collectible revenues. What's one thing that is guaranteed to coexist with such a situation? I'll tell you, corruption. Poke holes into an already small bottle of water and the leakage will guarantee that you have nothing left to drink. That pretty much explains the story of China. The nation's tax system is riddled with corruption, and as expected, this has a detrimental effect on tax collection rates. Tax officials are often accused of taking bribes, which influences the outcome of tax investigations and distorts the law's implementation. And because each local government is largely left to their own devices, there is plenty of room for unscrupulous activities to take place, and this makes corruption all the more likely. This level of widespread, unmitigated corruption in Chinese society contributes to low tax collection rates and a gross disregard for the law. I can only imagine that this, unchecked, will keep poking holes into the already small pockets containing China's taxes. Adding to the factors that are currently contributing to China's taxation revenue problem is none other than tax evasion. I'm pretty sure that one or two of you may have experiences with this, so you can understand how this factor is quite a big one. Tax evasion is exactly what it sounds like, evasion of taxes, and it's a practice that violates the spirit of the tax law and is a significant challenge for China's tax officials, which inhibits China's revenue collection rates. The phenomenon is popular in many countries, as we can attribute to the nature of man, but tax evasion in China is quite substantial. It is fueled by the fact that, due to the ambiguities of China's tax system, there's a severe lack of transparency that shrouds the whole system. That then results in multiple loopholes that can be exploited for personal gain by various entities and individuals. Another of the things that makes it possible for there to be a lot of tax evasion is the nature of Chinese tax laws themselves. These laws, too, are riddled with ambiguity and areas of contention that one can cleverly exploit. Although, just like in most countries, it seems like the rich are the ones that stand to benefit the most from this. Talking about Chinese policies, let's talk about just how politics and political agendas can play into this. The CCP political agenda in itself is a big reason why China as a whole collects low taxes. You see, China's low tax policy is part of a broader government strategy to attract international businesses and investment to China. By keeping taxes low, China can offer lower production costs than other countries, thereby making its products more competitive in the global market. The basic gist of it is that the government's low tax policy also helps create favorable business environments that attract foreign investments, keeping the Chinese economy strong and growing. At the same time, the CCP always wants to create a system where they are popular with the masses and they are in favor. To this end, the central government institutes certain laws that will be favored by the people. For example, as we neared 2020, the Chinese government increased the tax-free threshold for monthly personal income from $520 to $745. That was about 3,500 to 5,000 yuan. What this did was to cut out a lot of low earners from paying taxes. Naturally, people were happy about this change politically, but economically speaking, it cost the nation quite a good chunk in taxes. The CCP followed this change with more tax reforms that allotted further tax deductions to be considered. These tax deductions include a wide range of household expenses like school fees, healthcare, and care for the elderly. It also included an element of mortgage interest relief. So think about it. The CCP cut down the number of taxpayers, and then they included several concessions for the existing taxpayers. Quite the chaotic mess, as you can see. To put it all into perspective, the number of people that were now required to pay no tax at all was about 80 million people. That's similar to having the entire state of California, Texas, and Florida being absolved from paying taxes. Imagine what that toll would do to the US. To add to this mental picture that you have, consider that because of these CCP tax rules, an additional 65 million people are now paying 70% less in personal income. That, ladies and non-ladies, is like absolving the entirety of France from paying taxes. This just gives you a picture of the severity of China's tax problems. This reduction in personal income tax leaves the nation reliant on indirect taxes, such as value-added tax, to try and have a healthy tax base. And just so we're all on the same page, indirect taxes are taxes levied on goods and services that are consumed in the economy. What the Chinese government then does is use VAT to tax all stages of production and distribution, from raw materials to the final consumer. As you can probably understand, that type of tax is easier to collect and enforce, because it's collected at each stage of production and the distribution phase. Also, because it's more targeted at businesses rather than individuals, there's a level of consistency and uniformity to it, something that is not quite offered by the personal income taxes. The problem, however, is that despite this policing of indirect taxes, they can't quite fill out the chasm that is left after cutting down on people's personal taxes. So because of this situation, fueled by political motives, China keeps having to reduce taxes, and all that does is just adds to the peril of the matter. So what is clear in this matter is this: China is having a problem, a big problem, and that is fueling the collapse of what until now has been one of the most impressive economic models in history. In fact, it's safe to say that no other nation in modern history has been as progressive as China has been economically. However, the taxation situation reduces revenue that could otherwise be sponsoring programs for the country. In the absence of this revenue, local governments are accumulating debt on a massive scale. Perhaps all these things are rooted in the fact that China's tax system works in a complex, multi-tiered manner, or perhaps the greed of men through corruption and tax evasion is to blame. One thing is certainly clear: certain measures need to be taken while the chance to do so still exists. The question becomes, what measures can be taken? Well, let's explore that, shall we? To stop suffering from this problem and create a better future for the nation, the first action that is needed is for the Chinese government to make adjustments that will widen the tax base. This can begin by making sure that all taxable people are included in the tax regime, without exception. Do you remember when I said about how it's currently like China has excluded California, Texas, and Florida from paying taxes? Yeah, all of them need to get back to paying their fair share. Along with this, as unpopular as it might be for a while, China needs to eliminate tax incentives and improve the tax bracket differentiation amongst its own populace. This step is especially essential because in China, many of the taxpayers are predominantly corporate bodies whose tax obligations are not always proportionate to their profits. And similar to the step, tax evasion needs to be stopped in its tracks. This can be done by strengthening the audit process, implementing stricter penalties for tax evasion, and improving coordination between the central and local tax departments. This last part is especially important. Once there is enhanced communication and cooperation between the central and local tax departments, there are massive benefits that will arise, as there will be fewer loopholes that people can exploit as a result of systematic inefficiencies. In all fairness, it's not like China has not been trying to enforce these tax laws.
After implementing a crackdown on tax evasion, China's tax authority has collected more than 11 billion yuan.
The amount of activity you're talking about in China would seem like there's an extraordinary investment in enforcement activity.
A Chinese live streaming personality has been hit with a hefty fine for tax evasion and kicked off social media.
Tax officials are striving to work closer with each other to prevent certain multinational corporations and wealthy individuals from exploiting tax loopholes.
They have implemented various measures to increase their tax collection, including deducting a portion of employees' salaries, reducing tax exemptions, and running advertising campaigns to encourage taxpayers to pay their taxes. These measures have not really been effective in generating enough revenue to cover the country's expenditures, and the country has been increasing its debts to finance its projects. However, a step in the right direction was in 2021. When Chinese livestream shopping influencer Huang Wei, known as Via, was fined a $210 million penalty for tax evasion after having been found guilty of massive tax evasion. She was investigated, and it was found that between 2019 and 2020, Huang had evaded more than 640 million yuan, or about $100 million in taxes, by falsely reporting the commission income she earned from live streaming platforms. To make an example of her, she was fined with a hefty penalty that was meant to deter others from doing the same thing. This brings a quote that I know to my head. Do the crime, pay the fine. If Chinese authorities keep pressing indiscriminately like this will minimize the number of people who are evading taxes, as everyone will know just how hefty the penalties are. Moving on. Remember when I said that China's tax system is riddled with ambiguities and loopholes? Well, that too is an area that can be fixed. China's government must improve anti-corruption measures by instituting intensive training programs for tax officials and developing IT systems to enhance transparency. This will not only make keeping track of things easier, but it will reduce the blurred lines that so often are used in the avoidance of tax payments. Most times, the practice of corruption stems from weak enforcement, incompetent public service, and a lack of comprehensive political will by those tasked with upholding the laws. With the right political will and technological know-how, it is possible to significantly reduce corruption and improve the government's ability to collect taxes at the local level. I'm not saying that this can happen overnight, but what I am saying is that if it's done right and given time, they can make significant strides for the entire system as a whole.
China.
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 The factory of the world.
The world's most populous country is facing a crisis.
China's population is aging.
Fertility rates are at an all-time low.
Gender imbalance in China.
Rapidly rising number of older people in the population.
It does not have young people to man its factories or join its army.
China is facing a crisis, threatening to end the nation as we know it in the coming few years. China's population crisis has gone from a social worry to a government emergency, as the population decline now begins to affect industry and commerce in the Eastern Giant. While many countries struggle with overpopulation, China, the world's most populated country with more than 1.4 billion people, has a different problem. Their population crisis manifests in that the citizens of the Dragon of the East are just not having enough, fun time. Yes, low birth rates are the bane of the nation. And these low birth rates might be what spells doom for the nation. In this video, I will explain 1. How low birth rates became a problem to begin with, and 2. The social and economic implications on China as a result. Let's proceed.
The rise of China is the biggest event in the recent economic history in the world. So within 30 years, in terms of growth rate of total GDP, China has break the record.
The biggest jump in GDP since China started keeping quarterly records in 1992. That is a very, very impressive figure. China seems to leave everyone else behind.
China's race to become the #1 economy, the output of what is now the world's #2 economy, is expected to surpass that of the US.
The Chinese economy is going to be probably at least twice as big as the US economy.
But, believe it or not, China has a population problem. The number of babies being born is going down.
China's population is aging. Seniors over 65 will make up a full third of the nation's population.
Well, we are about to witness a demographic crisis in China.
The seeds of China's present destruction began as a very different issue decades ago. In the late 1900s, China found itself facing a giant problem on its hands: overpopulation. The way the population was growing versus the agricultural output coming out of late 1900s China meant that such levels of population growth were simply unsustainable. In a bid to avoid hunger rampage across the nation, China decided to implement a very drastic set of policies, the most widely known being the one-child policy. Under this policy, families were limited to having only one child. The goal was that by limiting the number of children in every family to one, it would lead to fewer mouths to feed, and ultimately a more balanced population. This worked wonders, as the birth rate plummeted heavily over the decades that followed, so much so that it not only achieved its intended targets, but it then created a culture that has led China into the depths of despair that it is now in. But what the CCP didn't realize was that they were creating a problem for the future generation. You see, because of the one-child policy, theoretically, every couple or two people are only leaving behind one child. which is not enough to replace themselves. That's why the replacement birth rate is considered around 2.1 kids. 2 kids to replace each of the parents, and 0.1 for any unfortunate child deaths. Since the one-child policy didn't take this into account, it was just too powerful at slowing down the population growth. Talk about too effective of a solution. As a result of reduced birth rates, part of the problem with China's population is that it's aging out. As most of the population is approaching, or is in, retirement age, this creates quite the complex. Low birth rates and an aging population? Yikes. Let's look at the problems that come from that. Problems that are leading China into its destruction in the modern day.
The ruling Communist Party says it is scrapping a strict 2-child policy in response to the rapidly rising number of older people in the population. Beijing has enforced birth limits for 4 decades, but it's now concerned that a demographic crisis could add to pressure on its economy.
China's population grew by only 480,000 last year. That was the lowest in 60 years.
In absolute numbers, there are 33 million more men than women in China today. The gender imbalance in China is most severe in rural farmlands.
For those who engineered the single-child policy, the gender imbalance has been the worst unintended consequence.
The first social problem that can be easily identified as one takes a walk in the streets of China is that, as a result of the one-child policy,
it began in 1980. Only one child allowed.
Decades of families without brothers or sisters.
These harsh measures did reduce the number of births.
Decades, right, for the population to rebound.
A symbolic example of state control.
The one-child policy.
The one-child policy.
The one-child policy.
China has an extreme gender imbalance, as the nation has far more males than females. This formed as a result of parents favoring having male children to carry on the family name and bloodline over having female children. Practiced over generations, it seems that the effects are now in full bloom, as China has over 37 million more males than women. As simple as this sounds, this creates a whole host of social and cultural issues that affect the nation heavily. To begin with, China has a problem of bare branches, especially in rural China. This is a Chinese term for men who are single and are unlikely to find a wife in the future. As their presence in the rural landscape has grown, bare branches have increasingly attracted the concern of China's policymakers. In January of 2007, the Central Committee and State Council issued a report saying that the imbalance in the marriage market amounted to a hidden danger for society and will affect social stability. The government's anxiety over the surplus men is more or less buttressed by a growing body of research linking marginalized men to the likely spread of violent crimes, prostitution, sexually transmitted infections, and the trafficking of women. Several studies have drawn a connection between the historical outbreaks of peasant rebellions in China and surplus males. As we all know, the CCP is not a big fan of rebellion of any kind, so this creates a problem for them. Adding to the social problems that are being caused by China's population crisis, you will find that the gender imbalance is creating a high competition in marriage for the few females available. Chinese matchmakers always have more men than women, which means a lot of men go unmarried into old age. This further creates a disproportion in the birth rate, and it has also resulted in the thriving of online communities where young men spend money on females to find closure and comfort. This activity contributes to the collapse of Chinese morality and tradition in society. Consider this. China's population grew to 1.41 billion in the decade ending in 2020. Its lowest rate of growth since imposing a strict one-child-per-family policy in the 1980s. The National Bureau of Statistics announced that China added 72 million people between 2010 and 2020, an increase of 5.38%, with annual growth averaging 0.53%. As these statistics show, the population crisis in China is only getting worse. Where it becomes an economic problem is that a good portion of China's active workforce is aging, but there aren't enough youngsters to replace them in jobs all over the nation. This creates vacancies in key sectors all over the country. And because there's no manpower, economic growth slows down. As you can imagine, this is the last thing that China wants as it fights to surpass the US definitively in several metrics. The sector that has been affected the most by this labor shortage has been the manufacturing industry, as there is not enough manpower to man the industries in comparison to the past. On the other hand, certain analysts have argued that there's not so much a universal labor shortage as there is a mismatch in labor. The younger generation is shying away from manual jobs like farming and industrial work, which makes up a significant part of the economy. This, therefore, leaves a gaping hole in the labor pool, leading to the same problem: vacancies and slow economic growth. But labor shortages aren't the full scope of the problems that come with China's population aging problem. Other factors exist that are equally as puzzling to solve for the government. The reality of the situation, confirmed by the results of China's most recent census, shows that the silver generation is China's fastest-growing demographic. This demographic of senior people accounts for 1/3 of the country's purchasing, a fact that merchants and retailers are becoming aware of and factoring for. With growing spending power, more leisure time, and longer life expectancy, Chinese seniors are becoming a consumer group to be reckoned with. Given their growing will to live their golden years to the fullest, and taking into consideration how nuanced this huge cohort is, brands can create and communicate their products and services properly. China's population of people over 60 years old surpassed 254 million in 2019, accounting for 18.1% of the total population. No other country in the world faces such a significant demographic change. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, China's aging population will reach 330 million by 2030, accounting for 1/4 of the overall population. What this means in economic terms is that there will be a whole portion of China's population that will be retired and not actively contributing to the growth of the economy. Analysts have stated that the demographic dependency ratio, which is a measure of the dependence on a society's total working population, would go from 47% in 2019 to 96% in 2050. What this means is that in the not-so-distant future for China, for every retiree, there will be only one person working. This will undoubtedly put pressure on China's economy, as there will be a strain to take care of the retired population. Extra burdens will be placed on the benefits and the healthcare system, resulting in increased costs all around. Current estimates state that in 2027, retirement funds will peak at 7 trillion yuan, but then go to zero by 2035 due to the number of dependents increasing. As a result, a notable deficit will be felt between its inflows and expenses monetary-wise, and by 2050, the deficit will be in the trillions of yuans. The difficulties in maintaining the liquidity of the pension system are forcing the government to take extreme measures, like attempting to encourage more births and increasing the retirement age. But it might all be a little too late at this point. The government is not oblivious to the problems being faced in China. In fact, the CCP, realizing the trouble that China is in, has long since instituted a two-child policy. In May 2021, the Chinese government announced it would scrap that policy in favor of a three-child policy, allowing couples to have 3 children to try and increase the declining birth rates. This followed 2020, where the birth rate fell 15% to record a dismal 10 million births. In addition, China has started to try and address the low manpower problem by moving towards technological trends and trying to use technology and innovation to supplement the industrial sector. Basically, China is trying to transition the economy from being labor-intensive to a technological one. But it's key to note that the industrial sector constitutes 38% of the overall economy. And until full automation, the labor shortages will be felt in the present moment and for many years to come. These measures, at this point, just seem like desperate attempts to resolve a problem that is now far more than skin deep. After generations of the one-child policy, there are now facets of the Chinese economy that are so deeply ingrained that it will take decades to reverse the effects. The question, much like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, is what will come first? The destruction of China or the rebirth of the nation? This is China's Jiangling River, running dry because of record heat and drought that the country is facing. Just to show the true effect of this video, here's how the river looked before the drought. Recently, China's property woes, bank crisis, and foreign policy towards Taiwan have become hot topics on this channel and in the news media. It's easy to think this triad constitutes China's most significant problem. But no. There's another deadly crisis that threatens the Eastern nation as we know it. That is the water crisis. The current water crisis that China is facing might possibly be the biggest threat the country has on its hands. How bad is it, you ask? Well, it's this bad.
One of the worst droughts seen.
A record-breaking drought.
China's record heat wave and drought.
Hydropower reservoirs are currently down by as much as half.
Emergency measures to save electricity have come into effect.
With insufficient irrigation, crops here are dying. More than 350,000 people in rural Chongqing are suffering because of the shortage of water supplies.
Let's dive more into detail on China's dry spell and the CCP's role in worsening the situation. The truth that the CCP has hidden for many years but is now coming to light as an unavoidable catastrophe is that China is on the brink of collapse due to a water crisis. On top of internal incompetence by government officials, a multi-year drought, the worst China has seen in years, threatens to topple the country's already COVID-pummeled economy. Water has always been a big factor to look out for in China, and that is more apparent now than ever. According to the United Nations, though China is home to 21% of the world's population, it contains only 7% of the world's fresh water supplies. Ironically, most of these water supplies are located in southern China and not in its northern part where most of the population lives. At first, this might seem like a minuscule problem. It's just water after all, one might say. But as a former British diplomat and China expert Charlie Parton noted in 2018, China can print money, but they can't print water. It's either you have it or you don't. And, well, China doesn't have it. This is quite a problem for a nation that currently consumes 10 billion barrels of water per day. For comparison's sake, this is about 700 times its daily oil consumption. Yeah, let that sink in. One could arguably say water has been the silent hero behind China's decades of explosive economic growth, as it is essential for growing food, generating energy, and sustaining humanity. With as big an industrial sector as China has, this shortage of water is slowing down the economy and resulting in the closure of essential plants all over the nation. All this will serve to lower the forecasts on China's already meager growth predictions, further pushing the country into a full-blown recession. Now, with the drought and heat wave in full force, not only China but the United States and the rest of the world are likely to feel the effects of China's troubles. This is because, as the rivers and lakes dry out and the heat wave continues, that condition is going to have a significant effect on China's food and power production. Moreover, given China's scale as the second largest global power, this situation could also induce global food and industrial materials shortages on a far greater scale than we've ever seen in recent times. Given the country's overriding importance to the global economy, potential water-driven disruptions beginning in China would rapidly reverberate through food, energy, and material markets around the world and create economic and political turbulence for years to come. So yes, even you in the United States might end up being affected by Chinese droughts. To make the situation worse, the underground water supply simply can't help the thirsty population. A 2018 analysis of surface water by China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment found that 19% was classified as unfit for human consumption, and roughly 7% was unfit for any use at all. The quality of groundwater, which is critical for ensuring water supplies during droughts like the one China is currently facing, is worse. Over 30% of China's underground water is deemed unfit for human consumption, and 16% is deemed unfit for any use at all. Data from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization indicates that China uses nearly 2.5 times as much fertilizer and 4 times as much pesticides as the United States does, despite having 25% less arable land. A new study finds chemicals are often used inefficiently on small farms in China. Land and migration policies may help explain why the country uses 30% of the world's fertilizers and pesticides on 9% of global cropland. This could potentially have played a role in polluting their underground reservoirs. Where the CCP falls at fault is that for decades, Beijing has generally chosen to conceal the full extent of China's environmental problems to limit potential public backlash. In avoiding questions relating to their competence, the CCP has let the country fall into ruin. This lack of transparency, on top of droughts that China now faces, has resulted in the current mess. When we look at this water crisis scenario, it presents itself as 2 large problems in one. What makes it worse is that they spill from China's borders to the whole world. Let's run through them.
This year, extreme heat has severely damaged crops in India. Crop yields are falling globally, and there are more dire predictions.
Nearly 830 million people around the world went hungry in 2021. That's up nearly 50 million the year before.
Scorched, you see, certainly cannot grow. The high temperature is slowly roasting the sweet potato leaves to death.
China is taking emergency action, but the leaves and stems continue to die.
The first and most obvious problem that is likely to be faced is there's going to be a food crisis in the absence of water resources. A quick look into Chinese history reveals that famines due to droughts have helped topple at least 5 of China's 17 dynasties. This is because hunger and food shortages tend to remove whatever inhibitors people may have. Fully aware of this, the CCP has heavily emphasized maximizing grain production to ensure food security. This has resulted in policies where the government incentivizes farmers to maximize the production of corn, rice, and wheat to achieve self-sufficiency levels. The problem is, to sustain these harvests, farms and cities are pumping water far faster than nature can replenish it. Satellite data suggests that each year between 2003 and 2010, North China lost an amount of groundwater equal to more than twice of what Beijing consumes annually. And yes, that's a lot of water. As groundwater levels fall, many farmers are struggling to find new resources. Some are digging larger, deeper wells, often at a great cost. But continual overdraws may render water physically inaccessible, regardless of the pumper's willingness to spend on deeper wells and new pumping technology. Add to that the fact that underground water in China is contaminated and unsuitable, and the problem becomes even bigger. This could lead to a whole food crisis. Statistics show that if the North China Plain were to suffer a 33% crop loss because of water insufficiency, China would potentially need to compensate by importing approximately 20% of the world's internationally traded corn and 13% of its traded wheat. Typically, this would cause an imbalance in food imports globally, but such a scenario is not out of the realm of possibility, considering that a drought in early 2022 slashed Argentina's expected corn crop by 33%. To add to the problems, if the Chinese drought increases and affects the rice yields in southern China or Heilongjiang, it could create even larger market shocks given China's disproportionate share of rice consumption. And this is particularly so because all 3 major staple grains are critical for hundreds of millions of lower-income consumers worldwide. In previous videos, I've covered how China is already hoarding a large amount of the world's grain supply. If the water crisis and the drought persist, however, even with their stores, China could still be subjected to a multi-year yield shortfall. Such a scenario would result in China increasing its imports of grain from the global markets. As we witnessed when they hoarded the grain they now already have, such an action could trigger food price spikes in high-income countries. This would lead to shortages in those countries, resulting in widespread hunger globally. Also, as China buys up reserves to compensate for the shortfalls at home, they will render a lot of basics inaccessible to hundreds of millions of people in poorer countries, who can't afford a global food price war. As I've mentioned before, though the drought is in China and the water crisis is a failure on the CCP's part, the effects of this are going to be global. With China focusing on the preservation of its people, it seems the world is the one that is going to foot the bill for China's misfortunes, in particular, the poorer countries in the world. Furthermore, China's water crisis isn't only limited to its agricultural sector. No. It reaches beyond to affect other sectors as well, maybe even in a bigger capacity. Let's take a look at that.
The provinces in China's northeast are suffering some of the country's worst power cuts, with cities plunged into darkness lasting hours.
Shanghai is switching off the lights along its famous Bund riverfront.
Power crunch in some parts of China has shut down factories and left some households without electricity.
Factories that are suppliers to companies like Tesla, big polysilicon makers for solar panels, big lithium battery makers for EVs, they've had to reduce or shut down production because of this.
China has the largest energy sector in the world. With the kind of population China has and the size of its industrial sector, this doesn't come as a surprise. The challenge is that a lot of this power is hydroelectric, meaning they capitalize on the larger quantities of water to generate electricity. Even the other stations that take advantage of nuclear power also require water to cool reactor cores and used fuel rods. This is why almost all the Chinese power stations are built on banks of large water bodies, or at least somewhere close where they can easily access large water quantities. Now, with the rivers and lakes drying up due to the drought, most of these power stations have been forced to shut down, as they can no longer operate. Amidst the mortgage, property, and Taiwan crisis, this is only serving to show the weakness of the CCP. If China keeps closing down factories, and it loses just 15% of its hydropower production in a year because of low water levels behind dams, it would have to increase electricity output by an equal amount to what Egypt generates in a year to compensate. The only way to do that would be to use coal-fired plants. This will have the intended short-term effects, but in the long run, it will roll back their environmental progress and further increase the same contamination that has ruined their underground receivers. Oh, and did I mention just how water-intensive coal mining is? And you really can't have a running coal plant with limited coal, now can you? It's a losing situation however you look at it. This reduction in power output in China has the citizens feeling the brunt of the impact the most. This is causing anger, because amidst a heat wave, the government has chosen to limit electricity supply to the masses and even close factories like those of Toyota. People can barely use air conditioning systems. Beijing has, however, given special preferences to Tesla by allowing them to continue operating at capacity at the expense of their citizens. Something that the people aren't too happy about.
We cannot live through this summer without air conditioning.
Yeah, it's hot as hell. I'm melting.
It could affect residents and those that need to use the water.
Power crunch in some parts of China has shut down factories.
China does not have enough power to keep its factories running.
How did Tesla manage to get what it wanted in terms of its foray into China?
Wanted to be at the forefront of electric vehicles, made China more willing to negotiate with Tesla and to give them their turn.
When you consider that, at present, China is by far the world's largest producer of aluminum, ferrosilicon, lead, manganese, magnesium, zinc, most rare earth materials, and many other specialty metals and materials, you will see that there is an incoming problem. Power outages in even a single region can move global markets, a fact that Europe car makers discovered in late 2021 when power shortages curtailed magnesium smelter operations in Shanxi province, responsible for about 50% of global output. As magnesium inventories plummeted, prices spiked to 7 times their normal level at the beginning of the year, causing global problems in supply. Now, with all these key components at risk of a limited supply due to China's problems, there are likely going to be global supply chain challenges, as industrial facilities account for over 65% of electricity use in China. Blackouts by decree would disrupt several key material supplies, as we have already begun to see with the closure of factories. It is setting itself up as quite the great pending global catastrophe. Chinese officials are not oblivious to the direness of the disaster they have on their hands. The government, back in 2003, even launched the $60 billion south-to-north water transfer project, which draws water from tributaries of the Yangtze River to replenish the dry north. This was part of a scheme to draw water from the south of China, where most of the freshwater supplies are, to bring it to northern China, where most of the population lives. In addition, they've also deployed aircrafts and rockets to lace clouds with silver iodide, or liquid nitrogen, a process known as cloud seeding to boost rainfall. Other measures like relocating heavy industry away from the most water-stressed regions, along with massive investments in water management infrastructure, have been taken as well. In April of this year, the Vice Minister of Water Resources, Wei Xianxiong, estimated that annual investment in water-related projects could hit $100 billion. This shows the kind of effort that is being put into trying to solve the problem. However, in the face of the drought being faced, all this seems to be for naught. The harsh truth is that China's potential way out of this predicament is bounded by harsh economic, physical, and political realities. Economic solutions like the desalinization of water are proving too expensive, with very little to show for it. Physical solutions like the transfer of water from the south to the north are nigh impossible and also very expensive. Maybe above all of this, the CCP wants to protect its political power and image. Certain measures, though potentially effective, if they harm the CCP's preferred narrative of economic progress, are completely ruled out. At some point, the lines between maintaining power and actually improving citizens' lives are blurred. The whole world now waits to see what becomes of China's situation. And if the situation persists, then it will be clear that the rest of the world is on a deadline too.